So that idea there is we have this nexus, this accumulation of regulations that can cumulatively have a huge impact. Any one of those maybe wouldn't have been a big deal, but dealing with all of those together led to a doubling of the cost of their project. And I think it's easy to recognize that that's a problem, especially if those regulations, if all that red tape doesn't lead to any sort of benefits, as was the case there. There was no amount of environmental protection that came about as a result of all that. So then, if you recognize the problem, the next question is, well, why do we continue doing it? Why does this occur? So I'm an economist. I tend to think about things in terms of incentives. That gets me into problems at home often, but nonetheless, I think this is appropriate here to think about incentives of actors who could affect this. First is the incentives of agencies, the regulatory agencies that make the rules themselves. I used to work at one, and I've spent my career studying them. And I think it's pretty intuitively obvious to say when an agency has a regulatory program and can show that it's making more and more regulatory programs, that agency is going to expect the budgets to enforce those programs or to create new programs. That agency expects to have employees and hire employees when it makes new regulations. In short, as regulations grow, so does the power of the agency. And the people at the top of that agency, if they like power, if they like that prestige, if they like perhaps the promise of future income once they leave, will be happy to see that that growth occurs. And so there's incentive at the tops of the agencies to support a regulatory growth path as opposed to going back and getting rid of rules. There's also incentive in the rank and file at the bottom level. The economists and the lawyers who are on the teams that make new rules. I don't know if any of you have ever worked in an agency, but you probably are familiar with the awards process that goes on in agencies. You get plaques and you get sometimes bonuses for being parts of various projects. Those typically are awarded at when a team will make a new rule. Those are very rarely, if ever, awarded if a team says, oh wait, maybe we shouldn't make a new rule. Maybe it's not a good idea. The creation of new regulations is a measurable output that agencies tend to look at in order to judge their own employees. And employees realize that. They realize that if I can be part of teams that make more rules, then I'm going to get rewarded in my career. So there's incentive even at the lowest level inside agencies to make more rules, and little to none, unless you explicitly create that role for an employee, to look back and get rid of rules that maybe it makes sense to get rid of. You also have to think about where regulations come from. They don't ultimately come from agencies. They really come from politicians. They come from acts of Congress. That list that I read, those are all acts of Congress that led to regulations created by agencies, but going back to it, every single regulation has some statutory authority, and that is something that a politician created. Politicians have incentive to respond to visible and present crises. Things like if there's a sudden food safety scare, or if there's some other perceived public hazard that they think they can deal with an act of Congress, of course they're going to want to do that, right? They want to see that they want their voters, they want their constituents to see that they're acting to protect them. It's a very visible and present danger. On the other hand, something like regulatory accumulation and the consequences that it has on economic growth or on safety is much more hidden. It's much less visible. It's a lot harder to make the argument that what you're doing is going to serve your constituents if you're arguing for regulatory reform. So I would say that the incentives of politicians also push towards the creation of new regulations and don't push towards going back and reviewing existing regulations and getting rid of ones that make sense to get rid of. And then third, I want to throw this out there. Incumbent firms, businesses, may actually have an incentive to keep regulations on the books. And so a simple example here is if there is a set of regulations that required all factories to install some set of machinery that would maybe reduce pollution. All existing factories comply with that. They purchase the machinery, call it scrubbers on their smokestacks. Once they've done that, they've paid the cost. They've bought that machinery. And so now, suppose we realize looking back that that regulation wasn't a good idea, we didn't need those scrubbers after all, or there's better ways to accomplish this. Do you think that those factory owners are going to support getting rid of that regulation? Of course not, right? Because they want every new entrant, any new competition, to have to pay that cost as well. They want to keep that barrier of entry. That's a sort of moat around their business that protects them from new competition because new competitors would have to buy similar machinery. So the fact is, regulation can serve as a barrier to entry to incumbent firms. And so you shouldn't be surprised when occasionally an agency or a president will ask businesses to tell the agency or the president, what rules should we get rid of? What rules are really problematic for you? And businesses don't come up with a big, long list. Well, that's perhaps because businesses are protected by rules that are already in place.